asked. The settlements with Riverside Community Pool and Sunshine Recreation Center show a clear pattern of inappropriate conduct toward young females. Reeves frowned. Those settlements included confidentiality agreements. The defense will file motions to exclude that evidence as prejudicial and not directly relevant to this case. We'll argue that pattern evidence is admissible to show motive and intent, but the judge may limit what we can present. What if we can find other victims? Morrison suggested. If Hammond assaulted or harassed other girls at Splashtown, their testimony would be directly relevant. Detective Brennan nodded. I'll re-interview former employees and guests. If Hammond had other victims, they might be willing to come forward now that he's been arrested. Over the next week, Detective Brennan conducted additional interviews with 43 people who had been at Splashtown during the summers of 1985 through 1992. She used social media, alumni databases, and community outreach to locate former guests and employees. 3 women came forward with disturbing accounts. Ashley Rodriguez reported that in July 1987, when she was 15, Hammond had cornered her in an equipment storage room and made sexual comments about her swimsuit. She had reported the incident to her lifeguard supervisor, who had documented it, but nothing came of the complaint. Michelle Carter stated that in August 1988, at age 16, Hammond had touched her inappropriately while claiming to show her proper lifeguard rescue techniques. She had felt uncomfortable but hadn't reported it because Hammond was management, and she feared losing her job. Danielle Foster, daughter of the deceased general manager Gerald Foster, revealed that in June 1991, when she was 17, Hammond had pressured her to meet him privately after hours, claiming he needed to discuss her performance review. She had refused and told her father, who had confronted Hammond. Gerald Foster had documented the incident, but hadn't terminated Hammond due to pressure from the county supervisor's office. All 3 women provided written statements and agreed to testify if needed. Their accounts established Hammond's predatory pattern and directly contradicted his claims of professional behavior. On September 10, 1999, the extradition hearing took place in Phoenix. Attorney Daniel Webster argued that Hammond should be released on bail pending trial, claiming he was not a flight risk and had strong ties to Arizona. Assistant DA Reeves argued via video conference that Hammond faced life imprisonment without parole, had significant financial resources, and had demonstrated consciousness of guilt by maintaining files on Jessica's case for 13 years. Judge Martin Hughes ruled in favor of extradition without bail. The evidence presented demonstrates probable cause for first-degree murder charges. Given the severity of the potential sentence and the strength of the forensic evidence, the defendant presents a substantial flight risk. Bail is denied. The defendant will be transported to California to face charges. Hammond was transported to Riverside County Jail on September 13, 1999. He was formally arraigned on September 15 before Judge Margaret Thompson. The charges were first-degree murder with special circumstances, murder during the commission of kidnapping. The special circumstances made Hammond eligible for the death penalty. Daniel Webster entered a not guilty plea on Hammond's behalf. My client maintains his absolute innocence. The prosecution's case is built on circumstantial evidence and dubious forensic interpretations. We will vigorously defend against these charges and prove that Richard Hammond had no involvement in Jessica Mitchell's tragic death. Judge Thompson set a trial date for January 10, 2000, giving both sides time to prepare. She ordered Hammond held without bail and assigned the case high priority, given the age of the underlying crime and public interest. The media attention was intense. National news networks covered the arrest and arraignment. Jessica's case became a symbol of cold cases solved through advances in forensic science and persistent investigation. David and Laura Mitchell appeared on television, thanking law enforcement and asking other families of missing children not to give up hope. Detective Brennan continued investigating, knowing the defense would attack every element of the prosecution's case. She worked with Dr. Rourke to prepare comprehensive forensic presentations that would make DNA evidence understandable to jurors without scientific backgrounds. On October 5, 1999, defense attorney Webster filed multiple pretrial motions. He sought to exclude the DNA evidence, arguing that degradation over 13 years made the results unreliable. He sought to exclude witness testimony about Hammond's behavior toward other young women, claiming it was prejudicial. He sought to exclude the newspaper clippings found in Hammond's home, arguing they showed innocent interest in a tragic case, not consciousness of guilt. Assistant DA Reeves responded with detailed legal briefs defending the admissibility of all evidence. Forensic experts submitted affidavits explaining that DNA analysis techniques had advanced significantly and that the 13-marker match exceeded scientific standards for reliability. Legal precedents supported pattern evidence when establishing motive and intent. The newspaper clippings, combined with handwritten notes analyzing police search effectiveness, demonstrated more than innocent concern. Judge Thompson scheduled evidentiary hearings for November to rule on the defense motions. The outcome would determine what evidence the jury would hear and significantly impact the trial's direction. On October 18, 1999, Detective Brennan received a phone call from Martin Hammond, the former county supervisor and Richard Hammond's uncle. Martin was now 78 years old, retired from politics, living in Palm Springs. "I need to speak with you about my nephew," Martin said, his voice weak and strained. "I have information that might be relevant to your case." Detective Brennan drove to Palm Springs the next day. Martin Hammond lived in a modest condominium, far from the wealth and power he had wielded during his political career. He looked frail and ill, connected to an oxygen tank for emphysema. "I'm dying," Martin said bluntly. "The doctors give me 6 months, maybe less. I need to clear my conscience before I go." "What do you want to tell me?" Detective Brennan asked. "Richard came to me in August 1986, 3 weeks after that girl disappeared. He was panicked, sweating, couldn't sit still. He said police were asking too many questions, that people were suspicious. He asked me to use my influence to shut down the investigation, to make it go away. I asked him directly if he had anything to do with Jessica Mitchell's disappearance. He didn't answer. He just said he needed my help." "What did you do?" "I made calls. I spoke with the sheriff, suggested that resources were being wasted on a case with no leads. I implied that continued investigation might embarrass the county, that maybe the girl had run away and didn't want to be found. I used my political position to apply pressure. The investigation didn't stop completely, but it slowed down. Fewer resources, less urgency. Eventually, it became a cold case." Detective Brennan felt anger rising. "You obstructed a murder investigation to protect your nephew." "I didn't know it was murder. I thought maybe Richard had seen something, knew something, was afraid of being falsely accused. I convinced myself he was innocent and just needed protection from overzealous investigation. But I always wondered. When the park closed and Richard moved to Arizona, I felt relieved. Out of sight, out of mind. Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I was wrong. I enabled him. If I had let the investigation proceed without interference, maybe you would have found that girl in 1986. Maybe Richard would have been caught before he could hurt anyone else. I need you to know that I'm willing to testify about Richard's behavior, his panic, his request for my help. I won't die protecting him anymore." Detective Brennan took Martin's detailed statement. His testimony would be powerful, showing consciousness of guilt and explaining why the 1986 investigation had stalled despite strong leads. On November 3, 1999, Judge Thompson conducted evidentiary hearings on the defense motions. Dr. Rourke testified about DNA analysis reliability, explaining that the 13-marker match exceeded standards used in thousands of criminal cases. The defense's expert witness, Dr. Harold Klein, testified that environmental degradation could affect DNA results, but on cross-examination admitted that the protocols used in this case were scientifically sound and that he couldn't identify any specific flaws in the analysis. Jennifer Walsh, Carlos Mendoza, and Timothy Brooks testified about their observations of Hammond's behavior. The defense attorney attacked their memories, noting the 13-year gap, but each witness remained consistent and credible. Judge Thompson ruled on November 15, 1999. The DNA evidence is admissible. The forensic analysis meets scientific standards for reliability, and the 13-marker match provides sufficient statistical certainty. The witness testimony about the defendant's behavior and actions is admissible, as it establishes opportunity, knowledge, and consciousness of guilt. The testimony of other women about the defendant's inappropriate conduct toward them is admissible, under Evidence Rule 1101 as pattern evidence showing motive and intent. The newspaper clippings and notes found in the defendant's residence are admissible as they indicate consciousness of guilt and knowledge of investigation details. All defense motions are denied. This was a significant victory for the prosecution. The trial would proceed with the full force of forensic and testimonial evidence intact. The trial begins on January 10, 2000. The trial of Richard Hammond began in Riverside County Superior Court. Judge Margaret Thompson presided over the proceedings in a packed courtroom. Media representatives filled designated press seats, while David and Laura Mitchell sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, holding hands tightly. Jury selection took 3 days. Both sides sought jurors who could evaluate complex forensic evidence objectively, while understanding the emotional weight of a child murder case. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 64, representing diverse professional backgrounds including teachers, engineers, nurses, and business professionals. Assistant DA Thomas Reeves delivered the opening statement on January 13, 2000. He stood before the jury, his voice clear and steady. On July 12, 1986, 14-year-old Jessica Mitchell went to Splashtown Water Park for a day of summer fun with her parents. She was a happy, outgoing girl enjoying her summer vacation. She never came home. For 13 years, her parents wondered what happened to their daughter. They wondered if she had suffered, if she had been afraid, if she had called for help that never came. In August 1999, those questions were finally answered when Jessica's remains were discovered hidden behind a false wall in a pump room at the abandoned water park. Reeves approached the jury box. The evidence will show that Richard Hammond, the assistant manager of Splashtown Water Park, murdered Jessica Mitchell. He lured her to a restricted maintenance area, killed her with a blow to the head, and concealed her body in a location he knew would never be searched. He used his position of authority, his knowledge of the facility, and his access to restricted areas to commit this crime and cover it up. You will hear DNA evidence proving that Richard Hammond had direct physical contact with Jessica's body. You will hear testimony from forensic experts explaining that Hammond's DNA was found on Jessica's remains and on the towel used to wrap her body. The statistical probability of this being coincidental is less than 1 in 8 billion. You will hear from witnesses who saw Hammond near Jessica shortly before she disappeared. You will hear from employees who observed Hammond's inappropriate behavior toward young female guests and staff. You will hear about Hammond's suspicious actions after Jessica vanished, his interest in what witnesses told police, his monitoring of camera blind spots, and his unexplained absence during the critical time frame when Jessica was killed. The evidence will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Richard Hammond murdered Jessica Mitchell, hid her body, and evaded justice for 13 years. Now it is time for him to be held accountable. Defense attorney Daniel Webster stood for his opening statement. He was 62 years old, silver-haired and distinguished, known for his methodical cross-examinations and ability to create reasonable doubt. The prosecution wants you to believe that Richard Hammond, a respected water park manager with no criminal history, suddenly became a murderer in 1986 and successfully concealed his crime for 13 years. They want you to believe this based on circumstantial evidence, questionable identifications, and forensic results that can be explained through innocent contact. Richard Hammond did not kill Jessica Mitchell. He was a dedicated employee who worked long hours to ensure Splashtown operated safely. On the day Jessica disappeared, he was conducting routine administrative duties in the office, a fact confirmed by multiple witnesses and phone records. The prosecution claims he vanished from cameras for 66 minutes, but that's because management offices and workspaces weren't monitored. There's nothing sinister about an employee working in areas without cameras. The DNA evidence will be explained. Mr. Hammond worked at a facility where Jessica was present. He interacted with hundreds of guests daily. Transfer DNA through indirect contact is well documented in forensic literature. The presence of his DNA does not prove he killed her. It proves he worked at the same location where she spent the day. The prosecution will parade witnesses claiming Mr. Hammond behaved inappropriately, but you'll notice that not one formal complaint was ever filed. Not one investigation was ever conducted. These are retrospective accusations from people viewing innocent interactions through the lens of suspicion created by this prosecution. Jessica Mitchell's death was a tragedy. Her family deserves answers. But justice requires proof, not speculation. The prosecution's case is built on assumptions, not facts. At the end of this trial, you will have reasonable doubt about Mr. Hammond's guilt, and you will return a verdict of not guilty. The first witness was Dr. Philip Rourke. He explained the forensic examination of Jessica's remains, describing the fatal injury and the evidence of deliberate concealment. Using photographs and diagrams, he showed the jury where Jessica's body had been hidden and how the false wall had been constructed to appear solid. The remains were wrapped in a beach towel with cartoon dolphins, Dr. Rourke testified. The wrapping was deliberate and careful, suggesting the perpetrator wanted to contain the body and minimize odor during decomposition. The location behind the false wall in the pump room was chosen specifically because it would not be discovered during normal operations or routine maintenance. Assistant DA Ellen Morrison conducted the direct examination. Dr. Rourke, what was the cause of Jessica Mitchell's death? Blunt force trauma to the left temporal region of the skull. The injury caused immediate unconsciousness and death within minutes from epidural hematoma and brain herniation. Can you describe the weapon that caused this injury? Based on the fracture pattern, the weapon was a blunt object with a rounded surface, approximately 2 to 3 inches in diameter. The force required to cause this injury would be consistent with a full-strength swing by an adult male using a metal pipe or similar tool. Could this injury have been accidental? No. The location and force indicate an intentional strike. This was not a fall or accident. Someone deliberately hit Jessica Mitchell in the head with sufficient force to kill her. Daniel Webster cross-examined carefully. Dr. Rourke, 13 years passed between Jessica's death and your examination of her remains. How does that time frame affect your conclusions? Shahid Bunin, environmental factors degraded soft tissue, but skeletal remains and the injury to the skull were well preserved. The conclusions about cause of death are not affected by the passage of time. You testified that Jessica died from a blow to the head. Could she have been struck accidentally, perhaps by equipment in the pump room? The angle and force of impact are inconsistent with accidental contact with stationary equipment. This was a directed blow from a moving object wielded by a person. But you can't tell this jury who wielded that object, can you? No. Forensic pathology determines cause and manner of death, not the identity of the perpetrator. No further questions. The prosecution called forensic DNA analyst Dr. Linda Martinez. She explained the DNA extraction process from Jessica's remains and the comparison to Richard Hammond's reference sample. We recovered male DNA from 2 locations, Dr. Martinez testified. First, from the inner surface of the beach towel wrapped around the victim's remains. Second, from fabric fragments of the victim's swimsuit, specifically the shoulder strap area. We developed a 13-marker DNA profile from these samples. Ellen Morrison displayed the DNA comparison charts on a screen visible to the jury. Dr. Martinez, please explain what the jury is seeing. These are the DNA profiles. The left column shows the DNA recovered from Jessica Mitchell's remains. The right column shows Richard Hammond's DNA profile. At each of the 13 markers we examined, the DNA matches. This means Richard Hammond is the source of the male DNA found on the victim and the wrapping towel. What is the statistical significance of this match? The probability of randomly selecting an unrelated individual with this same 13-marker profile is approximately 1 in 8.3 billion. Given the current world population, it is scientifically certain that Richard Hammond is the source of this DNA. Could this DNA have been transferred innocently? The location and concentration of the DNA indicate direct, sustained contact. This was not secondary transfer from touching a surface that Hammond had touched. This was primary transfer from direct physical contact with the victim's body. How long can DNA survive in the environment? Under ideal conditions, DNA can survive for thousands of years. The pump room environment was cool, dark, and relatively dry, which preserved the DNA. While degradation occurred, sufficient DNA remained for reliable analysis. Daniel Webster approached for cross-examination. Dr. Martinez, you testified about the possibility of primary versus secondary DNA transfer. Isn't it true that forensic science cannot always distinguish between these two types of transfer? In some cases, that's true. However, the concentration and location of DNA in this case indicate primary transfer. But you cannot state with absolute certainty that the DNA got there through direct contact during a murder rather than through some innocent contact at another time, can you? The totality of the evidence, including the location of the DNA on the inner surface of the wrapping towel and on the victim's clothing, strongly indicates direct contact during or immediately after the crime. That's your interpretation. But other interpretations are possible, correct? Scientifically, the evidence supports direct contact. Alternative explanations would require multiple instances of transfer and specific circumstances that are unlikely. But unlikely doesn't mean impossible, does it? No, but the scientific standard is reasonable certainty, not absolute impossibility of alternatives. Webster paused, then continued. Dr. Martinez, Mr. Hammond worked at Splashtown where Jessica spent the day. He interacted with guests, equipment, surfaces. Isn't it possible that Jessica touched something Hammond had touched, transferring his DNA to her clothing or belongings? That would be secondary transfer. The concentration of DNA we found is inconsistent with secondary transfer. Additionally, the DNA was found on the inner surface of the towel, the portion directly touching the victim. Secondary transfer wouldn't result in that distribution pattern. But you're making assumptions about what is and isn't possible with DNA transfer. I'm applying established forensic science principles based on thousands of DNA cases. The evidence in this case indicates primary transfer through direct contact. The jury watched intently, taking notes. The DNA evidence was complex, but Dr. Martinez's testimony was clear and confident. Webster had raised questions, but hadn't shaken the fundamental conclusion that Hammond's DNA was found on Jessica's body in a pattern suggesting direct contact. The prosecution's case was building methodically, establishing that Jessica had been murdered and that Richard Hammond had physical contact with her body. The next phase would establish opportunity, motive, and consciousness of guilt. The witnesses speak. On January 18, 2000, the prosecution called Marcus Chen to the witness stand. He took the oath and sat down, his expression serious. Assistant DA Ellen Morrison began the direct examination. Mr. Chen, please tell the jury about your employment at Splashtown Water Park in 1986. I worked as a lifeguard during the summer of 1986. I was 19 years old in college, working to earn money for tuition. I was stationed at the wave pool most days. Do you remember July 12, 1986? Marcus nodded. That's the day Jessica Mitchell disappeared. I was working the wave pool that morning and afternoon. Jessica came through my station twice. She was a friendly kid, excited about the park. Did you notice anyone paying particular attention to Jessica that day? Yes. Richard Hammond, the assistant manager, walked past my station multiple times. He seemed focused on the younger guests, especially girls. Jessica wasn't the only one he watched, but I noticed him looking in her direction several times. How did you come to discover Jessica's remains in 1999? I returned to the abandoned park to retrieve old equipment manuals for a community pool project. I was in the wave pool pump room when a shelf broke loose from the wall, revealing a hidden space behind it. That's where I found the remains and the name tag identifying Jessica Mitchell. Daniel Webster cross-examined. Mr. Chen, you testified that you noticed Mr. Hammond watching young girls. Isn't it true that as assistant manager, Mr. Hammond's job was to observe all guests to ensure safety and proper conduct? Yes, but this was different. He wasn't watching in a professional capacity. His attention seemed personal. How can you distinguish between professional observation and personal interest? Etnini, body language, duration of observation. The fact that he kept returning to the same areas rather than circulating throughout the facility. But you're not a behavioral expert, are you? You're making subjective interpretations of actions that could have innocent explanations. I know what I saw. It made me uncomfortable then, and it makes sense now knowing what he did. Objection, speculation, Webster said. Sustained, Judge Thompson ruled. The jury will disregard the witness's conclusion about what the defendant did. Webster continued. Mr. Chen, 13 years passed between 1986 and when you found the remains. How can you be certain your memories of that day are accurate? Some days you remember clearly. The day a child disappeared from your workplace is one of those days. I've thought about it many times over the years. The prosecution called Jennifer Walsh next. She described her experience as a 17-year-old lifeguard and Hammond's inappropriate behavior toward her and other young female employees. He would stand at the pool edge watching us work, Jennifer testified. He'd make comments about our swimsuits, ask personal questions about our dating lives, request private meetings. Several times he asked me to stay late for additional training, but the training never happened. He'd just want to talk, get close, touch my shoulder or arm unnecessarily. Did you report this behavior? Morrison asked. No, he was management. I was a teenage employee making minimum wage. Reporting him would have meant losing my job. Everyone knew his uncle was a county supervisor. Nobody wanted to cross him. Do you remember the day Jessica Mitchell disappeared? Yes, I was working the diving well. Around 2:30 I saw Hammond walking quickly toward the restricted maintenance area near the pump rooms. He looked like he was trying not to be noticed, moving fast, checking around him. That seemed unusual for management. What happened 3 weeks after Jessica's disappearance? Hammond came to my house. He said he was checking on employees, but his questions were strange. He asked what I remembered about that day, whether police had questioned me extensively, whether I had mentioned anything about staff members to investigators. It felt like he was trying to figure out what I knew. Webster's cross-examination focused on memory and interpretation. Ms. Walsh, you testified that Mr. Hammond walked quickly toward maintenance areas. Couldn't he have been responding to an equipment issue or operational problem? He could have been, but combined with everything else, it seemed suspicious. Everything else being your subjective interpretation of professional behavior as inappropriate attention? It wasn't just me. Other female employees felt the same way. We talked about it among ourselves. But none of you filed formal complaints. Did none of you document these concerns? None of you reported it to authorities? We were teenagers. He was powerful management with political connections. We were afraid. Carlos Mendoza testified next about Hammond's unusual presence in pump rooms and the office cart parked outside the wave pool pump room entrance on July 12, 1986. Assistant managers didn't normally bring office carts to maintenance areas, Carlos explained. Those carts were for moving paperwork and supplies between administrative buildings. Seeing one outside a pump room was odd. When I asked Hammond about it later, he said he'd been moving old files to storage, but there was no storage in that pump room. You also testified that Mr. Hammond spent considerable time in pump rooms despite limited mechanical knowledge. Can you elaborate? He'd go down there for 30 or 40 minutes at a time, supposedly learning the systems, but when I'd try to teach him about pumps and filtration, he didn't retain the information. I'd explain the same things multiple times. It seemed like learning the equipment wasn't really why he was there. What do you think he was doing? Objection, speculation, Webster said. Sustained. Mr. Mendoza, please limit your testimony to what you observed, not conclusions about intent. Webster cross-examined. Mr. Mendoza, you testified that Mr. Hammond had difficulty learning pump operations. Isn't it possible he simply wasn't mechanically inclined? Yes, that's possible. And the office cart could have been used for any number of legitimate purposes that you weren't aware of, correct? I suppose so. You never actually saw Mr. Hammond do anything improper in the pump rooms, did you? No, I didn't see him commit a crime if that's what you're asking. But his behavior was unusual. Timothy Brooks testified about Hammond's visit to the security office and his interest in camera blind spots. He specifically asked which areas cameras didn't monitor, Brooks said. When I showed him the security map, he studied the blind spots carefully. The pump rooms were among the areas without camera coverage. Why weren't pump rooms monitored? Morrison asked. They were restricted maintenance areas. We monitored public spaces where guests were present. Management areas and mechanical spaces weren't considered security priorities. Did you see Mr. Hammond on security cameras during the time period when Jessica disappeared? He appeared on cameras at 2:12 near the main office. He didn't appear again until 3:18 near the front gate. For 66 minutes he wasn't captured by any camera in the facility. Webster challenged this on cross-examination. Mr. Brooks, how many blind spots existed in Splashtown's camera coverage? Approximately 30% of the facility had no camera coverage, including all management offices, break rooms, storage areas, and maintenance spaces. So an employee could work in those areas for extended periods without appearing on camera, correct? Yes. And that would be completely normal and innocent, wouldn't it? For normal work, yes. You have no evidence that Mr. Hammond did anything other than normal work during that 66-minute period, do you? No direct evidence, but the timing is suspicious given that Jessica disappeared during that exact time frame. The prosecution called Laura Mitchell. She walked to the witness stand slowly, her hands trembling. David Mitchell watched from the gallery, tears streaming down his face. Morrison's voice was gentle. Mrs. Mitchell, I know this is difficult. Please tell the jury about Jessica. Laura took a deep breath. Jessica was our only child. She was bright, outgoing, loved swimming and music. She was excited about starting high school in the fall. We took her to Splashtown that day because she'd been asking all summer to go. We thought we were giving her a fun summer memory. What happened that afternoon? Jessica didn't meet us at the designated time. We searched for an hour, asking staff for help. When we couldn't find her, security called police. The search went on for weeks. We never stopped hoping she'd be found alive. But as time passed, we accepted that someone had taken our daughter from us. During your time at the park that day, did you notice anyone paying unusual attention to Jessica? Yes. I saw a man in a staff polo shirt standing near the concession area watching Jessica. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there watching her. I remember thinking it seemed odd, but there were so many staff members around that I didn't consider it dangerous. Morrison showed Laura the 1986 photograph of Richard Hammond. Is this the man you saw? Laura studied the photograph, then nodded. I believe so. I can't be completely certain after so many years, but the build and appearance match my memory. Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. No further questions. Webster approached carefully, his tone respectful. Mrs. Mitchell, I'm sorry for your loss. I need to ask some difficult questions. You testified that you saw a man watching Jessica. How far away were you from this man? Perhaps 50 or 60 feet. And he was wearing sunglasses? Yes. So you couldn't see his eyes or the upper portion of his face clearly? That's correct. 13 years have passed since that day. Memory can be affected by time, by suggestion, by seeing photographs. Is it possible you're not remembering the actual person you saw, but rather the photograph police showed you? Laura hesitated. I don't think so, but I admit I can't be absolutely certain. Thank you for your honesty. The prosecution called Rebecca Torres to testify about her deceased sister Maria's statement that she had seen Hammond near Jessica and that he had followed in the same direction when Jessica left the concession stand. Maria served Jessica at 2:25, Rebecca testified. Maria told me that evening that Jessica had been friendly and happy. Maria also said she saw a man in a staff shirt watching Jessica. When Jessica walked away, the man followed. Did Maria identify this man? She thought it was Richard Hammond, but she wasn't completely sure because he wore sunglasses. She reported it to investigators, but they said it wasn't definite enough. Webster objected. This is hearsay. Maria Torres is deceased and cannot be cross-examined, Morrison responded. Maria's statement to investigators in 1986 is documented in the case file. We're not offering this for the truth of identification, but to show that a staff member was observed near Jessica shortly before she disappeared, Judge Thompson ruled. The objection is overruled for the limited purpose stated by the prosecution. The jury is instructed that this testimony shows an observation was made and reported, not that the identification was definitive. The prosecution called Ashley Rodriguez, who testified about Hammond cornering her in an equipment storage room in 1987 and making sexual comments. Michelle Carter testified about Hammond touching her inappropriately while claiming to demonstrate rescue techniques in 1988. Danielle Foster testified about Hammond pressuring her for private after-hours meetings in 1991. Each woman's testimony was powerful, describing a pattern of predatory behavior toward young females. Webster objected repeatedly, arguing that these incidents occurred at different times and didn't prove anything about Jessica's murder. Judge Thompson allowed the testimony as pattern evidence showing motive and intent. On January 25, 2000, the prosecution called Martin Hammond, the defendant's uncle. The courtroom fell silent as the elderly man walked slowly to the witness stand, oxygen tank wheeling beside him. Richard Hammond stared at his uncle with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Mr. Hammond, what is your relationship to the defendant?" Morrison asked. "Richard is my nephew. I was a county supervisor in Riverside County from 1976 to 1996. Did your nephew contact you after Jessica Mitchell's disappearance in 1986? Yes. In early August 1986, about 3 weeks after the girl vanished, Richard came to my home. He was extremely agitated, sweating, pacing. He said police were asking too many questions and people were suspicious of him. He asked me to use my political influence to make the investigation go away. Did you ask him if he was involved in Jessica's disappearance? I asked him directly if he had anything to do with it. He didn't answer. He just kept saying he needed my help, that the investigation was destroying his reputation. What did you do?" Martin's voice was heavy with regret. "I made calls. I spoke with the sheriff, suggested that resources were being wasted, that the case had no leads. I used my position to apply pressure to reduce the intensity of the investigation. I convinced myself Richard was innocent and just needed protection from false accusations. I was wrong. I enabled him." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Thompson gavelled for order. Richard Hammond leaned toward Webster, whispering urgently. Webster's face was grim. "Why are you testifying now?" Morrison asked. "Because I'm dying, and I need to tell the truth. My nephew killed that girl. I helped him escape justice for 13 years by interfering with the investigation. I can't die carrying that guilt. Jessica's family deserves justice, and I need to do what I should have done in 1986. Webster's cross-examination was brief. "Mr. Hammond, you're testifying while terminally ill, correct?" "Yes." "You're on significant pain medication?" "Yes, but my mind is clear." "You have no direct knowledge that Richard killed Jessica Mitchell, do you? You didn't witness the crime." No, but Richard's behavior and his plea for help told me everything I needed to know." "That's your interpretation, not evidence. It's the truth." The prosecution rested its case on January 26, 2000. They had presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, pattern evidence, and consciousness of guilt. The case against Hammond was comprehensive and compelling. Now it was the defense's turn to present their theory of innocence. The defense case. Daniel Webster began the defense case on January 27, 2000, by calling Richard Hammond to the witness stand. This was a risky strategy, as it subjected Hammond to cross-examination, but Webster believed direct testimony was necessary to humanize his client and challenge the prosecution's narrative. Hammond took the oath and sat down. He wore a conservative suit and appeared calm, though his hands gripped the armrests tightly. Webster began with background questions. "Mr. Hammond, please tell the jury about your career in aquatic recreation management." "I've worked in the industry for 24 years. I started as a lifeguard in high school, worked my way up to assistant manager positions, and eventually became a regional manager overseeing multiple facilities. I'm responsible for safety standards, employee training, and operational efficiency at 6 water parks. Have you ever been convicted of a crime?" "No, never." "Adoy. Have you ever been formally accused of inappropriate conduct toward minors?" "No." The prosecution presented testimony from women making vague allegations about feeling uncomfortable, but no formal complaints were ever filed. No investigations conducted. No evidence of wrongdoing found. Let's talk about July 12, 1986. Where were you that afternoon? Why, I was in the administrative office conducting quarterly inventory. This was a routine task requiring several hours of work. I reviewed supply orders, counted equipment, checked maintenance logs, and documented everything for accounting purposes. The prosecution claims you disappeared from security cameras for 66 minutes. How do you explain that? The administrative offices weren't monitored by cameras. I was working at my desk, making phone calls, reviewing paperwork. Phone records show I made 3 calls from the office line that afternoon, including one at 3:30. I couldn't have been in the pump room killing Jessica Mitchell while simultaneously making documented phone calls from the office. Did you know Jessica Mitchell? Sure. No, I never spoke with her, never interacted with her. Splashtown had over 2,000 guests that day. I couldn't identify individual children unless they were involved in incidents requiring management attention. The prosecution presented DNA evidence showing your DNA was found on Jessica's remains. How did your DNA get there? I have no idea. I worked at a facility where Jessica spent the day. I touched surfaces, equipment, railings throughout the park. Transfer DNA through indirect contact is well documented. The presence of my DNA doesn't mean I killed her. Webster displayed diagrams of Splashtown's layout. Did you have reason to enter the wave pool pump room in your capacity as assistant manager? Yes. I was responsible for overseeing maintenance operations. I regularly inspected pump rooms to ensure safety compliance and proper equipment function. Could you have touched surfaces that Jessica later touched, or vice versa, resulting in DNA transfer? Absolutely. In a facility with thousands of daily visitors and constant equipment use, DNA transfer through surface contact is inevitable. Did you kill Jessica Mitchell? No, I had no reason to harm that child. I spent my career protecting children at recreational facilities. This accusation is devastating and false. Assistant DA Thomas Reeves approached for cross-examination. His tone was sharp and prosecutorial. Mr. Hammond, you testified that you never spoke with Jessica Mitchell. How can you be certain of that when you claim you couldn't identify individual children among 2,000 guests? I don't recall any specific interaction with her. Let me ask differently. You saw Jessica Mitchell at the park that day, didn't you? I may have seen her among many other guests. I don't have specific memory of her. Laura Mitchell testified that she saw you watching Jessica near the concession area. Maria Torres reported seeing you near Jessica and following when she walked away. Were those women lying? They may be mistaken. 13 years have passed. Memory is unreliable. Or they're telling the truth and you were stalking Jessica Mitchell. Objection, argumentative, Webster said. Sustained. Mr. Reeves, rephrase. Mr. Hammond, multiple witnesses testified about your inappropriate behavior toward young females. Ashley Rodriguez said you cornered her and made sexual comments. Michelle Carter said you touched her inappropriately. Danielle Foster said you pressured her for private meetings. Were all these women lying? Those allegations are exaggerated or misinterpreted. I supervised young employees. Sometimes my management style was misunderstood. Your management style of cornering teenage girls in storage rooms and making sexual comments? I never did that. Your management style of touching young women while claiming to demonstrate rescue techniques? Physical demonstration is part of lifeguard training. Your management style of asking teenagers to meet you privately after hours? I discussed performance reviews with employees. That's normal management practice. Reeves picked up the forensic report. Let's talk about DNA. Dr. Martinez testified that your DNA was found on the inner surface of the towel wrapped around Jessica's body. Can you explain how your DNA got on the inside of that towel through innocent contact? I don't know. I can't explain every possible transfer mechanism. The inside of the towel, Mr. Hammond. The part directly touching Jessica's dead body. How did your DNA get there? I don't know. Because you wrapped her body in that towel after you killed her, didn't you? No. Dr. Martinez also testified that your DNA was found on Jessica's swimsuit shoulder straps. How did your DNA get on her clothing? Transfer through surfaces we both touched. What surface would transfer your DNA to the shoulder straps of a swimsuit worn by a 14-year-old girl? Hammond hesitated. I can't specify the exact mechanism. Because there is no innocent mechanism. You touched Jessica Mitchell. You grabbed her shoulders. You killed her. That's how your DNA got on her clothing. That's not true. Reeves displayed photographs of the pump room and the false wall. You're familiar with the infrastructure of Splashtown's pump rooms, correct? Yes, as part of my supervisory responsibilities. You knew about the hollow spaces in the walls? I knew the basic construction, yes. Did you know about the false wall where Jessica's body was hidden? No, I had no knowledge of that specific space. But you knew the pump room layout better than almost anyone else at the facility, didn't you? I was familiar with it, yes. Familiar enough to know where a body could be hidden without discovery? Objection? Speculation, Webster said. Withdrawn. Mr. Hammond, let's discuss the newspaper clippings found in your home office. Why did you save every article about Jessica's case? I was interested in the outcome. It was a major incident at a facility where I worked. Interested enough to keep detailed files for 13 years? Yes. Interested enough to write notes analyzing police search effectiveness and witness statement consistency? I was following the case closely. Why would an innocent person need to monitor how effective police searches were and how consistent witness statements were? I wanted to understand what happened. Reeves held up copies of Hammond's handwritten notes. You wrote search radius insufficient and pump systems not checked thoroughly. Those notes suggest you knew where Jessica's body was and were relieved that searches didn't find it. That's your interpretation. I was simply observing that the searches hadn't been successful. You wrote witness statements inconsistent. Why did you care whether witnesses were consistent unless you were worried about being identified? I was analyzing the investigation. That doesn't make me guilty. Your uncle, Martin Hammond, testified that you came to him 3 weeks after Jessica disappeared and asked him to use his political influence to shut down the investigation. Why would you do that if you were innocent? I was being treated unfairly. People were suspicious of me without cause. I wanted the pressure to stop. Or you wanted the investigation to stop before police discovered Jessica's body in the pump room you regularly accessed. That's not why. Martin Hammond testified that he asked you directly if you were involved in Jessica's disappearance, and you didn't answer. Why didn't you simply say no? I was upset and confused. The question felt accusatory. Or you couldn't say no because it would be a lie. Objection, Webster said. Sustained. Mr. Reeves, move on. Reeves returned to his table and picked up the timeline. Mr. Hammond, you claim you were in the administrative office from 2:30 to 3:15. Phone records show you made a call at 3:30, but you don't appear on any security camera between 2:12 and 3:18. Where were you during that 66-minute gap? In the office working. I explained this already. The office is an 8-minute walk from the wave pool pump room. If you left the office at 2:25 and walked to the pump room, you could arrive by 2:33. If you killed Jessica quickly and hid her body, you could return to the office by 3:15, giving you time to compose yourself before making the 3:30 phone call. That timing works perfectly, doesn't it? That's speculation. I was in the office the entire time. But you can't prove it, can you? You have no camera footage, no witnesses who saw you continuously during that period, no time-stamped documents proving your location minute by minute. 6 employees verified I was in or near the office that afternoon. Near the office, not in the office every minute. Your alibi has holes, Mr. Hammond, and Jessica Mitchell's body was hidden in a location you had unlimited access to during a time frame when you can't definitively prove where you were. Hammond's composure cracked slightly. I didn't kill her. I don't know how to make you believe me. I don't need to believe you. The evidence speaks for itself. Your DNA on the victim. Your presence near her before she vanished. Your absence from cameras during the critical time frame. Your knowledge of the hiding place. Your efforts to monitor the investigation. Your uncle's testimony that you asked him to interfere with law enforcement. All of that proves you murdered Jessica Mitchell. No, I'm innocent. Reeves stared at Hammond for a long moment, then returned to his seat. No further questions. Webster called several character witnesses who testified that Hammond was a responsible manager, a devoted family man, and a respected member of his community. Neighbors, colleagues, and business associates described him as professional and trustworthy. The defense called Dr. Harold Klein, a DNA expert who testified that transfer DNA was possible and that the prosecution's interpretations were not the only scientific explanations for the evidence. On cross-examination, Reeves forced Klein to admit that the concentration and location of Hammond's DNA made innocent transfer highly unlikely. Webster called former Splashtown employees who testified that they had seen Hammond in the office area during the afternoon of July 12, 1986. On cross-examination, Reeves established that none of them could account for Hammond's whereabouts during every minute of the critical 66-minute time frame. The defense case was weaker than the prosecution's. Webster had raised questions and suggested alternative explanations, but hadn't produced compelling evidence of innocence. Hammond's testimony had been defensive and evasive, particularly under Reeves's aggressive cross-examination. On February 3, 2000, both sides rested. Closing arguments were scheduled for February 7. Justice delivered. The courtroom was packed on February 7, 2000 for closing arguments. David and Laura Mitchell sat in their usual seats, holding hands. Richard Hammond sat at the defense table, his face pale and drawn. Assistant DA Thomas Reeves delivered the prosecution's closing argument. He stood before the jury, his voice firm and clear. 14 years ago, Jessica Mitchell went to a water park for a day of fun. She never came home. For 13 years, her parents lived with unanswered questions and unbearable grief. Now you know the truth. Richard Hammond murdered Jessica Mitchell. The evidence is overwhelming. Hammond's DNA was found on Jessica's body and on the towel wrapping her remains. The statistical probability of this being coincidental is 1 in 8 billion. That means if you tested every person on Earth, you would not find another match. Hammond's DNA is there because he touched Jessica's body after he killed her. The DNA was found on the inside of the wrapping towel and on Jessica's swimsuit shoulder straps. Dr. Martinez testified that this distribution pattern indicates direct physical contact, not innocent transfer. Hammond grabbed Jessica, killed her, and wrapped her body in that towel. Multiple witnesses saw Hammond near Jessica before she disappeared. Laura Mitchell saw him watching Jessica at the concession area. Maria Torres saw him follow when Jessica walked away. Hammond was stalking Jessica, waiting for an opportunity to get her alone. Hammond vanished from security cameras for 66 minutes, exactly when Jessica was killed. He claims he was in the office but can't prove it. The timeline fits perfectly for him to walk to the pump room, kill Jessica, hide her body, and return to make his 3:30 phone call. Jessica's body was hidden behind a false wall in a pump room that Hammond accessed regularly. He knew that location intimately. He knew searches wouldn't find her there. He used his insider knowledge to conceal his crime. After Jessica disappeared, Hammond monitored the investigation. He visited employees to learn what they told police. He checked camera blind spots. He kept newspaper clippings with notes analyzing search effectiveness. He asked his uncle to use political influence to shut down the investigation. These are the actions of a guilty man trying to escape justice. 3 other young women testified that Hammond behaved inappropriately toward them. He cornered them, touched them, pressured them. This establishes a pattern. Hammond was a predator who used his position to access victims. The defense argues that innocent explanations exist for everything, but when you put all the evidence together, there is only one explanation that fits. Richard Hammond murdered Jessica Mitchell. He lured her to the pump room, killed her with a blow to the head, and hid her body where he knew it wouldn't be found. Jessica was 14 years old. She trusted that adults at the park would keep her safe. Instead, Hammond betrayed that trust in the most horrific way possible. He stole her life, destroyed her family, and evaded justice for 13 years. Now it's time for accountability. The evidence proves beyond any reasonable doubt that Richard Hammond is guilty of first-degree murder. Jessica's family has waited long enough for justice. Give them the verdict they deserve. Find Richard Hammond guilty. Daniel Webster stood for the defense's closing argument. His tone was measured and methodical. The prosecution wants you to believe that Richard Hammond, A man with no criminal history suddenly became a murderer in 1986. They want you to convict based on circumstantial evidence and interpretations of DNA that can be explained innocently. Let's examine the evidence objectively. The prosecution's timeline requires you to believe that Hammond left his office, walked to the pump room, encountered Jessica, convinced her to follow him into a restricted area, killed her, hid her body behind a false wall, and returned to his office in approximately 50 minutes. That's an incredibly tight timeline requiring everything to go perfectly without being seen by any of the 2,000 people at the park that day. The DNA evidence sounds compelling until you understand DNA transfer. Hammond worked at a facility where Jessica spent the day. He touched surfaces, equipment, railings. Jessica touched the same surfaces. Transfer DNA through indirect contact is scientifically documented. The presence of Hammond's DNA proves he worked at Splashtown, not that he killed Jessica. The prosecution called witnesses who claimed Hammond behaved inappropriately, but notice that not one formal complaint was ever filed. Not one investigation was conducted. These are retrospective accusations from people who now interpret innocent interactions as sinister because prosecutors suggested they do so. Laura Mitchell testified that she saw a man watching Jessica, but she couldn't definitively identify him because he wore sunglasses. 13 years passed. Memory fades. Seeing photographs of Hammond influenced her recollection. This is not reliable identification. The prosecution claims Hammond's absence from cameras proves guilt, but 30% of the facility had no camera coverage. Employees regularly worked in those areas. There's nothing suspicious about an assistant manager spending time in offices and management spaces that weren't monitored. Martin Hammond testified that his nephew asked for help with the investigation, but asking for help doesn't prove guilt. Richard was being treated unfairly, suspected without cause. He naturally turned to his uncle for support. That's what families do. The prosecution has not proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They've presented circumstantial evidence that can be explained innocently. They've relied on witness identifications that are uncertain. They've interpreted DNA evidence in the way most favorable to their theory while ignoring alternative explanations. Richard Hammond is innocent. He dedicated his career to protecting children at recreational facilities. He had no motive to harm Jessica Mitchell. The real killer is still out there, and by convicting Richard Hammond, you would allow that person to escape justice. The burden of proof is on the prosecution. They must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They haven't met that burden. You must return a verdict of not guilty. The jury received instructions from Judge Thompson on February 8, 2000. They began deliberations at 10 o'clock that morning. The courthouse waited tensely for a verdict. On February 10, 2000, after 2 days of deliberations, the jury sent a note indicating they had reached a verdict. Judge Thompson reconvened court at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed in. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Thompson asked. The jury foreman, a 52-year-old engineer named Thomas Park, stood. "We have, Your Honor." "What is your verdict?" "In the matter of the people of California versus Richard Hammond, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted. Laura Mitchell collapsed into David's arms, sobbing. Richard Hammond sat motionless, his face blank with shock. Daniel Webster immediately requested that the jury be polled. Each juror confirmed the guilty verdict individually. Judge Thompson set sentencing for March 15, 2000. Hammond was remanded to custody without bail. As deputies led him from the courtroom, he turned to look at his wife and children in the gallery. Patricia Hammond was crying, holding their children close. Outside the courthouse, David and Laura Mitchell spoke to reporters. "For 13 years we've waited for this day," David said, his voice shaking with emotion. "We knew someone killed our daughter. Now that person will be held accountable. Jessica can finally rest in peace." Detective Sarah Brennan stood with Assistant DA Thomas Reeves. "This case shows that justice can come even after years have passed," Reeves told the media. "Advances in forensic science, persistent investigation, and witnesses willing to come forward eventually revealed the truth. Richard Hammond thought he'd escaped justice, but he was wrong. Over the next month, the prosecution prepared sentencing recommendations. Under California law, first-degree murder with special circumstances carried a sentence of either life without parole or death. Reeves decided to seek life without parole rather than the death penalty, citing the age of the case and the definitive resolution provided by the conviction. On March 15, 2000, the sentencing hearing took place. David and Laura Mitchell testified about the impact of Jessica's death on their lives. "We lost our only child," Laura said through tears. "We've lived with a hole in our hearts for 13 years. Every birthday, every holiday, every milestone Jessica never reached has been agony. Richard Hammond stole our daughter and destroyed our family." Judge Thompson addressed the court. "Richard Hammond, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of the first-degree murder of Jessica Mitchell. The evidence proved that you used your position of authority to access and kill a 14-year-old girl. You hid her body and evaded justice for 13 years. You showed no remorse, no acceptance of responsibility. This court finds no mitigating factors that would justify leniency. Dean, I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. You will spend the rest of your natural life in custody of the California Department of Corrections. You will never again have the opportunity to harm a child." This court hopes that this sentence brings some measure of closure to the Mitchell family. Hammond was transported to California State Prison to begin serving his sentence. His appeals would take years, but the evidence was solid. The conviction would stand. Jessica Mitchell's remains were released to her family. On March 25, 2000, a funeral service was held at Riverside Community Church. Over 200 people attended, including former Splashtown employees, investigators, and community members who had searched for Jessica in 1986. David Mitchell delivered a eulogy. "Jessica loved life. She was excited about high school, about her future. Richard Hammond took all of that away from her, but he couldn't take our memories. We'll always remember Jessica's smile, her laughter, her kindness. She'll live on in our hearts forever." Jessica was buried at Riverside Memorial Park. Her headstone read, "Jessica Ann Mitchell, 1972-1986. Beloved daughter, forever 14. Justice served 2000."